God was moving his people out of their old life, out of the limitation, out of, in this case, the literal bondage. And what awaited them was his land of promise that was full of his blessing, greater benefits, and his presence. When God announces what's happening, our immediate assumption is always that when God is moving in his power and that he's announced the amazing things he has for us, we rejoice because we also expect that it's going to be easy. But in this case, it was anything but easy. What really happened was more akin to birth pains. That there were a series of what can variously be described as anything from wonders and miracles to plagues that was going to push them out. And the process brought great apprehension. But there came a moment, and this is in Exodus 8, where God says, from this moment on, I'm making a difference between my people and everyone else. And from that point forward, that difference, that distinction, meant that everything that was happening, that happened just right around them, completely observable, but it never impacted them. Now, some could choose to still be fearful, but God's promise was it was happening around them, but not impacting them. And in that process, God ejected them from their old life to move them into this new one, this land of promise that was awaiting them. But for you and I, what's really important is to stop and take a moment to reflect on that difference, that distinction he made among his people. Now, that word literally means that God redeemed them. He bought them. They were his. It's the very same concept we see in the New Testament where Jesus' sacrifice redeemed us and we belong to him. But on that theme of that distinction, what makes them different, what we find is that distinction that God places on his people is invisible but observable. And let me explain. Take Abraham. What we see is with all of the patriarchs, one of the common threads is continually this comment that gets made that it's obvious that God is with you in all that you do. And that didn't necessarily mean that everything was easy. It wasn't like a good luck charm. We see that with Isaac, that all of the contention that he had with people who were stopping up his wells and how he had to press forward, continue on. But then in the process, Abimelech comes to him and says, it is obvious God is with you. Let us make an agreement. Promise you will be our friends. I think we can interpret that to a degree. They're intimidated. Hey, if God is on his side. But that theme again goes on and on and on. We see that with Joseph in adverse circumstances, but that led to his promotion. We see Jacob in this relationship with Laban where what we continue to see is even though they're continually trying to cheat each other, that God was there. And Laban actually recognizes this continually, that he is blessed for Jacob's sake. And then eventually when Jacob leaves, he recognizes it's God that's given him the wealth. It's an observable distinction. Now, why am I sharing that? One of the things we see, though, is that it's not, even though in Exodus it was all of God's people, what we see is later on with that same group, that Moses, his face would shine from the glory of his time in God's presence. There was a distinction at that point between him and the rest of the people. And what we see, though, is from those distinctions, we see a number of factors. One is God is glorified. That what we see is God's presence is undeniable. That those around us recognize something that we could never describe ourselves. We also see that God's presence in their lives, that distinction, had this overflow benefit. Again, going back to Joseph, both in Potiphar's house, prison, and even Egypt, The whole point was that it would be a blessing for more than just Joseph, more than just even God's people, that it would overflow and touch others. But really what I'm leading to is we live in a time when we need to recognize that there are those that are distinct, and it's a faith choice. While there are a few things we do to reinforce it, we can't make it happen. There's not a checklist. But I think we have to come to that point of, by faith, choosing that, God, I want to be distinct. I want to be recognizable. That, as the New Testament says, that we would be set apart for His purposes. And that's not a formal appointment as much as is just that submission to God and claiming all that He offers. Now, in the process, we claim it by faith. We allow Him to make us set apart. We allow Him to fulfill His purposes in our lives, to open doors we could never open. And we recognize it's an attribute that, again, is invisible, but it becomes highly observable to those around us. But we can learn a couple of lessons that help facilitate, reinforce it. Abraham, again, his distinction was his willingness to surrender the need to understand, the need for comfort, to just truly follow God on all that he had. With Moses, that distinction was that he was invested in his relationship with God. In fact, not just spending time, but remember, when God is frustrated with the people and He's willing to fulfill His promise, but not necessarily that His presence would be among them. And Moses just flat out said, as much as we want that promise, unless you go with us, I don't want it. Unless you're going to be right with us, I don't want it. And that distinction was observable on Moses' face. But we also see with Moses that as time went by, that when he wasn't in God's presence, it did fade. But circling back around to where we started, we live in a time when we need those who are distinct. And frankly, we live in a time that's tumultuous. But we also want to claim that. Why? Because going back to Exodus 8, see, when God redeemed His people, it did not mean that all of that upheaval, all of the challenges, the miracles, the wonders, whatever term you want to put on it, that didn't go away. However, it also didn't impact His people. And as we know, eventually, by following His direction, they would leave with this amazing blessing in every way, not just wealth, health, the whole thing. We live in a time when we need a people who, by faith, allow God to set them apart, to make them distinct, to invest themselves while they go about their life, invest themselves in Him and watch Him work. And then there is a little promise to throw out that later the Bible in the Old Testament says, in that day, 2 men from every nation will take your hand and say, let us go with you to worship God. See, that consequence of being distinct is it will attract those that God is calling. So how do we become distinct? I think a big part of it is our choosing by faith to accept that option. That we would choose to claim that by faith, allowing God to, again, set us apart, make us distinct. And even when we may not recognize it ourselves, even when we may not feel it ourselves, recognize it's observable to the world around you.